Angie Mezza-Smith, the latest, the greatest, the most amazing queen of contracts herself, is gracing us again to talk about the NAR DOJ settlement. I'm hoping you're there this time, Angie.
I'm here.
Technical issues. Okay, got it. Awesome. I'm just curious what's going on with it and what we Georgia agents and even mortgage brokers, lenders, what we can expect to see, or any advice you have for us, because I'm sure you've started to see some of the ripplings of it starting now.
Absolutely, and some confusion. So, yes, I've been teaching a lot of the mid-year changes. You know, GAR came out with a package of mid-year changes to the Georgia Association of Realtor forms to address compensation issues. I would say a couple of things that we need to be aware of that people are confused about is that if you have a listing, let's just take it one.
I was about to ask you that.
Let's say you're a listing agent. Just to be clear, when you're a listing agent, the seller has hired you, the seller has contracted to pay you. So the compensation issue is coming from the seller, and we have to be very careful as listing agents that even if you have a team and you have buyer agents on your team, when you send a buyer agent on your team or another agent to host an open house or anything of that nature, you all are working on behalf of that seller that hired and agreed to pay you. No buyer is required to sign any documentation in order to see your listing. So it's not the same as the requirement. Okay. It's not the same as the new requirement that buyers hiring a buyer representative, even if they're only going to be a customer, it's not the same requirement when it's a listing, because you have the compensation has been agreed to. It's just been agreed to be paid by seller. And so what I have seen happen on a few occasions, and I've been trying to educate agents around it, is listing agents being confused and thinking that their buyer agent needed to have a buyer sign a buyer agreement before they could enter a listing. And I'm here to tell you, and I verified this with the legal counsel for GAR, there is absolutely no requirement, and as a matter of fact, it be perceived as an unfair trade practice if you say to somebody, you can't see my listing if you don't sign something. So we're getting confused here because we think, buyers can't, I can't show a buyer if they don't sign something.
That's what I thought.
That's if you are working on the buyer's behalf and you are the buyer's agent. Whether they are a client or a customer, we have compensation agreements. You can have either the exclusive buyer brokerage that has compensation in it. You can have the non-exclusive buyer brokerage that has compensation, or you can have the newly revised F-116 buyer working as a customer, working with a buyer as a customer form that also has compensation in it, because it's all about before you go replacing the transmission, somebody signing the estimate saying, I'm going to pay you $5,000 for replacing this transmission. It works very much the same. You do not need to do that if you are representing the seller, because the buyer's not obligated to pay you. The seller is paying
you. To stay in our lane is what you're saying.
Correct. And not get those two blurred. That's one thing that's been a big confusing factor.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
The other thing is that I'm going to tell you right now, if you are representing buyers and you have a buyer brokerage agreement that predates the July 1st changes, it is missing something very important, and that is the consent paragraph, where the buyer has consented to you being able to receive compensation from a seller or broker. So you need to take that consent language that's in the new version and use the GAR Amendment to Brokerage Agreement, which I think is Form F-728, but it's
oh my gosh, you're so good.
There's a GAR. No, don't quote me on that. You'll be like, oh, that's the right form number. But
Amendment to Broker Engagement, that's an easy form. We all know that one. Yeah.
And you need to simply state, buyer hereby consents to buyer's broker being paid compensation in the amount of blank or in the amount not to exceed blank by seller or seller's broker. And you just need to make sure that that is done, because let's say you were already under contract and and the buyer brokerage agreement predates and is kept alive the entire time you're under a purchase and sale, just like a listing is kept alive the entire time you're under a purchase and sale. But it predates the July 1st revisions. You still have an enforceable buyer brokerage agreement, but it's lacking that very important information.
Oh, gosh.
And if closing is actually of the purchase and sale is not going to occur till after these changes go into effect, that's a problem. And so
that's everything right now moving forward.
That is absolutely the one document that has to be amended is the buyer brokerage agreement, to add that consent paragraph if you have a buyer brokerage agreement that is on the version that predates the July 1st changes.
Which is everybody who's out there showing right now, basically. I mean, if they've been showing since July 1st, I didn't know that was the date that they updated them. But I also noticed the instructions to closing attorney have changed.
Correct.
I have 2 closings this week, and both of them I had to redo for the closing attorney. And
Correct.
you have to have your seller sign it. It's crazy.
Correct. And so the formatting on that has changed, and
it's added like a line or something.
Well, basically, one of your biggest things as a listing agent now is determining, are you going to do in your listing agreement, did you do the gross commission method, which is what we've had in the listing agreement for decades.
I know.
A large enough amount of commission that the seller has agreed to pay, and that amount, if the seller has consented to allow a buyer broker to be paid, will be shared with the buyer broker. If that's the case, then you have to disclose that not only in your listing agreement where the seller's agreeing to it, but you have to check the second box under the buyer broker optional compensation box.
Right.
Okay, that's how you're doing it. But
right, I've noticed that too.
You have to disclose that in the pre-showing compensation as well as in the instructions to closing attorney. And if that's the case, the seller is not technically required to sign the instructions to closing attorney or the pre-showing compensation if it's gross commission with the broker sharing. If, however, you've done the separate pay method where you have filled in your listing agreement with paying you your portion only and paying the other broker their portion only, and then you check the first box to indicate that the seller is paying each broker separately, in that case, that has to be disclosed again in the pre-showing compensation form as well as the instructions.
What is that form? Oh, my gosh. Here we go.
I'll tell you, that's important, and we'll talk about that.
Thank
but
you. As
well as the instructions to closing attorney, you have to disclose that, and then you would fill in the instructions to closing attorney instead of filling in box 1 with the gross commission and then the third portion in box 2, you're going to put the separate amount that you get as the listing agent in box 1, and then in box 3 you put the separate amount that seller is paying the buyer's broker. Now, at the end of the day, guess what, guys? It's all going to look the same on
the same thing. They're just making it complicated.
It's going to look the same on the settlement statement, but if you have it broken up into separate pay method, where the seller is paying each broker separately rather than the gross method being shared, that seller is required to now sign both the F-258 pre-showing compensation as well as the instructions closing attorney form. Now, you asked me what the pre-showing compensation, that is now basically, it's kind of like, the only way I know how to describe it, it's kind of like an affidavit disclosing what is in your listing agreement. So let's say you have a listing agreement, Amber, I can't see your listing agreement without a subpoena. That is not my business. I have no right to demand your listing agreement. But now that the buyer broker compensation, if any, has been agreed to be paid by the seller, is not going to be advertised on Georgia MLS, for example.
Right, that's the biggest thing,
This is going to become a part of our day-to-day procedures. It's going to be something that buyer agents need to ask listing agents to provide. And you as a listing agent don't have the discretion to just alter that amount. You are just disclosing what is in your listing agreement. So the F-258 pre-showing compensation agreement is something I recommend that if you're a listing agent, you go ahead and prepare that document, and you prepare it at the same time that you do a listing, or if you already have an existing and you're just now doing it, no problem. Date it today, and then there's a box where you put how long is this alive, put the number of days remaining on your listing term. So if you have 30 days left on your listing term or 180 days left on your listing term, put that number of days in that document.
Awesome.
And simply disclose the amount of the buyer broker compensation. But if you have any special circumstances where that buyer broker compensation would be altered, changed, lowered, whatever, for instance, you have in your listing agreement that if the seller's broker shows the property to the buyer before
I always put that in there. Yeah.
Then you have to put
I
that
don't put that
in
in
this
there,
agreement as well. Because
so like if I say, oh, it's only X, Y, and Z number of potatoes, if I find the buyer or if the buyer calls me off a sign and seller's cool with me having someone on my team in some cases, or somebody at my brokerage or myself writing the offer for them, still being their fiduciary, acting as a customer to this buyer, then I could put that in there and say it's this much amount.
Nope, that would.
I don't have to put that in there.
You're changing that's not if you're changing the commission that the seller.
Oh, okay.
It's only if you're the advertised commission that is being that is offered to a buyer broker would change. For example, if the buyer contacted you directly and asked you to see the property, and then they later hired another agent. All I'm saying is we used to be able to put that condition
in the notes and stuff
in the private remarks, and we can't do that anymore. So
I don't like that anyway.
I agree. But if an agent is using that type of advertising,
which is a lot,
advertise the whole shebang, that this is not a buyer broker commission offered, and here's the circumstances for which it would be changed. You have to be super transparent about that.
Good.
And, in the pre-showing compensation agreement, you need to also check the appropriate box. So if you are doing the gross method, it's the second box indicating that. If you're doing the separate pay method, and that's what the seller agreed to in your seller's broker agreement, you check the first box. And so that's the kind of thing that is going to basically have to be filled out. And you need to have this available. You can put it on your personal website. You can direct people on how to find it using an autoresponder email, where you're giving people instructions on how to find this on your listings when they email you about availability. But what you can't do is you can't do showing time. You can't find it showing time, and you can't upload it as a document in Georgia MLS.
Yeah, because showing time is an affiliate of or owned by. Yeah.
Correct.
Oh, man. So I have a question. I just had an experience where we went under contract. My seller, I'll pretend this is hypothetical. My seller had agreed to offer 3 potatoes to the buyer's agent, 3 potatoes to the listing agent, myself. So 6 potatoes total, 3 and 3. And then we got an offer that was below asking price. And she said, well, no. According to the DOJ and NAR, I don't have to pay them anything. And I said, well, it's always negotiable, but let me look into this and call you back. So I told the agent, look, my seller, or let's say I told the agent, my seller only wants to offer you 1 potato. The agent said, well, forget it then. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Did you consult your buyer about this? He was going to pull the plug without telling his buyers that, like, here's their, because all they would have to do is just come up a little bit and finance it potentially. And that's a Cassie question. But what do you not see that being another issue?
So first of all, the buyer is the one, the agents don't have a right to, quote, pull plugs on.
Oh, I know. That was the most disgusting
the
part
party.
of it.
Right. So they're not the party to the contract that makes the contract go binding. But there is a license law, Title 43, under the Unfair Trade Practices, that says that you can't impose upon a broker, and remember, it's always about the broker, not the individual agent. You can't impose on a broker a reduction in their commission without their consent. So you cannot make that a part of the negotiation to reduce their commission.
What if it was in the MLS and changed that day to one potato?
Well, if it was in the MLS and changed that day, then now, again, you'd have to prove that it was amended to your listing agreement and not just
okay.
MLS. It's all about the listing agreement. And now, whenever you sign this pre-showing compensation form, you're going to be locked into whatever it says. And so
maybe it will be more clear cut now.
In a lot of ways, it will be more clear cut, and also agents are thinking they're getting a little confused by the title of that form. The reason it was titled pre-showing compensation agreement was because the GAR committee was trying to encourage agents to try and for the best interest of the buyer, because ultimately it affects.
We were supposed to do that anyway.
That they want the agents to ask for that form before they show the property. However, what I'm advising is, even if you don't get the form and you ask for this form on all the properties you're planning to show on Saturday, for example, and you don't get the form signed and returned by all these listing agents, maybe 50% of them respond and give you the form, show the property anyway, because at the end of the day, whenever it's time to write an offer on one of these properties, if you have not received the pre-showing compensation document with the amount of buyer broker compensation in it, then that's when you decide, okay, either at time of writing the offer, we have this pre-showing compensation document where the buyer can see that the seller is paying the buyer broker compensation, which will offset what they owe in the way of compensation. So the buyer's okay with that. Great. Then we don't have to include the compensation as a part of our purchase and sale negotiation. However, if we don't have that signed document, then that's when the rubber's going to meet the road, and that's when it's then going to be advisable that you include the new exhibit, the F-259 compensation exhibit, if the buyer wants you to, because ultimately it's up to the buyer, and the buyer says, I don't want to have to pay the additional cash to close the pocket. So if that's the case, then you can include the F-259 exhibit as a part of the contract, or you can use you can use the GAR special stip, which is a simple way to do it, special stip 620, and ask for the seller to pay buyer broker compensation. Neither of those forms, though, authorize or induce the seller to lower their agent's compensation. They're simply asking the seller to pay this on buyer's behalf. So it will affect the seller's net, but not affect what they are agreeing to pay their agent, because we can't do that.
Right. So quick question. I thought part of this legality thing, and I was mental noting it because everybody has buyers. They make the world go round. I thought part of it was like, when I go to show a property, I have to have, in my back pocket, technically speaking, I have to have something signed saying, okay, so that is the truth. You do have to have something signed. If you're representing a buyer and you have a buyer that wants to show someone else's listing, the answer to that is absolutely yes. That's what I thought. Okay.
A customer or a client, they can be an exclusive client or not exclusive client.
Or that property only or one day only.
Correct. You could make it a short term. You can make it a short term brokerage agreement. You can even specify in the special steps the properties that are being shown that day, and you can make it a very short term, but you want to definitely make sure it's got a decent protection period in it, like 90 days would be my recommendation. Of course, that's always negotiable, like all terms are, but you would definitely have to have that secured before you work on behalf of a buyer. What agents were being confused by is they're hired by seller and a buyer randomly calls and wants to see that listing, and they're thinking, oh, I can't show a buyer. No, you are hired, and the money part is what's got to be agreed to. And the money part is taken care of by your listing agreement, because you're not asking the buyer to pay anything. The seller has agreed to pay for that transmission to be replaced. You don't need to get the buyer to agree to pay to replace the transmission, because the seller has hired you, and if services are rendered, the compensation's been agreed to. It's different if you're wearing your buyer agent hat and, and you are then going and working on the buyer's behalf. You must have established that that buyer will pay that broker that holds your license compensation for services rendered if they end up wanting to buy one of the properties that you identify for them.
And you've always taught us that you need to get a buyer broker agency agreement. It's like not that much has changed. It's just that you can't just willy-nilly go show people, right?
They can be a customer. We have a customer. They want to be a customer rather than a client. So it's about establishing the compensation. It's all about the money, and really it's about the money because it's all about transparency to the public. So it's just like, I'm not going to replace your transmission and then later come after you and say, you owe me $5,000. If we didn't have an agreement before that work, it is very much the same way. Before I go and do this work and then try and come after you and say you owe us money, you have to agree that you're hiring me and that you understand you're going to be responsible for paying money. And you know, basically what I think this is, because the plaintiffs and the allegations and all of the things, part of the issues in the lawsuits that ended up
the class action,
were bait and switch tactics. Just say to a buyer, don't worry, buyer, my services are free. Exactly. So you already knew the answer to that, because that bait and switch tactic had been widely used. But it's absolutely inaccurate, because to imply to a buyer that the services that you were doing on their behalf were free and that some other person, being a seller, was for sure going to pay the commission when the seller had no legal obligation, that is why this is now required.
Yeah, and they've never had an obligation, and I know you preach this from the rooftops, but that's the misconception, especially amongst new agents. Yeah.
It's an accurate way of telling buyers something that simply was not true. And so it's all got to be affirmed in writing, that this is absolutely not true. We do not work for free. Even if I decide that I'm going to work for, $5, it doesn't matter. It's not free. That's up to the broker and their agent.
Someone's paying that.
You can't put a zero in that blank.
I see. I love it. The transparency is really the key, as per usual, right? It seems like it all comes back to that.
Transparency. And now more than ever, agents need to, try their best to obtain that pre-showing compensation agreement. Listing agents are going to have to come up with clever ways.
That was my next question.
House, put them in a flyer box outside the house.
Lord, that scares me.
Yeah, I mean, you just need to have. I am highly recommending that you make an autoresponder email.
I like that.
Directions on how to obtain this information when they email checking availability. Also, when people set appointments, you know that you have showing appointments on your listing. You can't use showing time to deliver that document. But what you do is you could copy and paste those emails, and you could send all of those agents that are set to show your listing the next day, and you could just go ahead and blast that document to all those agents. You can even blast it out yourself and just do a big mass group email to all of them and blind copy all their email addresses and send it all to them even before they ask. So there's going to be, it's just a matter of.
It's going to be trial and error a little bit, I feel like, but we got to be careful though, right?
Yeah, and I'm coming out with memos of best practices and things like that.
Oh, thank God.
Trying to, and I think you attended at least one of my mid-year changes classes.
Yeah, I've been to like 2 or 3 of them.
Okay,
I'm always
but
late,
it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. Absolutely. And I will share. I finally got one of them to record. I'm not mistaken. I will send you the recording as well.
Amazing. Oh, is that what you? I think you did send me something like that.
You're right. I did. I specifically.
Amazing. No, your wealth of knowledge is like so helpful, and whether this was like a popular podcast or not, I feel like you could share it with agents at Keller Williams, agents at, XYZ Realty, and we can all get on the same page, because a lot of it's just misinformation out there. And I listen to podcasts all day long, and I send them to you, and I'm like, listen to this one. Some of those people are like off their rocker. They're like, oh, I'm going to make a separate website that says, here's what I'm charging and here's what I'm not, and da-da-da. I don't really want to mess with all that, Angie. I don't want to get sued.
Exactly.
I don't want to be the guinea pig that gets sued for trying to recreate the wheel. Like, just follow the rules.
You just have to communicate better, and you also have to remember that when you structure as the seller's agent, when you structure the way that your commission is going to be paid by the seller, whether it's the gross method or the separate pay method, you have to make sure you're checking the appropriate box, and that you are disclosing that in the pre-showing compensation, you're disclosing that in the instructions to closing attorney, and also in the exhibit, if the exhibit is something that gets attached to your
offer or whatnot.
But I will say this, there is no need, and I would recommend that you absolutely do not include the broker compensation exhibit, the F-259 exhibit to a purchase and sale, if you have the pre-showing compensation at an agreeable amount with the buyer, signed off by the listing agent, the buyer's agent, and seller if applicable. There is no need. That is better than any MLS advertising of a co-op commission could ever be. It's basically an affidavit where you're putting your signature, your seller's putting their signature on it and saying, buyer agent and buyer, this is what our listing agreement says. And there is absolutely no need to then use the exhibit to make
that'll confuse attorneys.
To make the compensation a part of the purchase and sale when it is absolutely not necessary. The only time that exhibit is necessary is if there is either no pre-showing compensation document signed, or the pre-showing compensation is reflecting an amount of buyer broker compensation that is less than the buyer wishes for the seller to cover. And the buyer says to their buyer agent, I would like to basically have the ability to finance in that commission into the sales price. I want the seller to cover more than they're agreeing to cover, and so therefore I want that to be a part of my negotiations. Then and only then would you use the F-259 broker compensation exhibit. Or if you would rather keep it simple, the GAR Special Stick 20 is also an alternative.
Question for you. So if I have two properties under contract that close after, and isn't it August 17th is like D-Day? Isn't that when?
That's the day that NAR has told us that the changes are going into effect. So that is what everyone is going by.
So if they're correct, and we don't know because they're not communicating with us because they're so wonderful and we pay them all these dues. Sorry, just a side note. If that's correct and they actually do that and actually do it, then if I wake up on August 17th, which is what, Saturday or something?
Saturday.
All my listings, all 20 of them, there's going to be no compensation for buyer agent.
No. They're perfectly fine. If they had compensation in them for buyer broker,
it'll just be gone. That field will be gone, right?
The field will be gone in the
That's
list.
What I was wondering.
Actually, I think that changeover
in the MLS.
Georgia MLS. But the field will be gone, but the actual obligation is established by your list.
Of course.
That is fine. But that's the software will update on its own. And
right.
The software will update on its own. So that's when you're going to ask for the pre-showing compensation, the F-258. So you need to go ahead and
so it's on them, really. But I do need to probably get ahead of the curve. And
I would absolutely recommend to make your life easier that you date them with the current date. Like, let's say you did them tomorrow. You date them the current date. Then you look at how many days are left on your listing term and put that as the term of how long this compensation offer is in existence. And then you just fill out the the amount of compensation that the buyer broker would be getting, and then check the second box, because I'm sure if these are older listing agreements that you're using the gross method, 6 potatoes total, 3 potatoes to buyer agent, for example. And so you would fill out the 3 potatoes or whatever to the buyer agent and check the second box, sign it, and technically your seller doesn't even have to sign it if you're doing the gross method.
It's very straightforward. I love that form. I used it the other day.
I'm actually going to advise, just because there is so much confusion, that you go ahead and make it a practice that when you get docs signed by the seller, just go ahead and have your seller.
Oh, good point.
Because it's going to.
One less thing to get them the DocuSign.
It's not going to hurt anything to have the seller's signature on there. It's going to cut down on confusion and questions about why the seller signed.
Okay, next question. Get excited. This is a good one. So what if your seller is bipolar and decides, well, then I'm not going to pay them a commission?
Well, it's all about what they agreed to in the listing agreement.
Okay, so we would have to do an amendment now then.
You'd have to do an amendment to the listing agreement.
Okay, then I have a lot of amendments to do, because everybody's like, well, if I don't have to pay it, I'm not going to pay it.
Then you'd have to. Then you'd absolutely have to do that.
It hurts their saleability. Ugh.
It does, and I would say that if first of all, have them read the compensation paragraph that's been added to the purchase and sale. Also, make sure you're providing all the time the CB10, the GAR consumer brochure, CB10 GAR form to your
CB10. Okay, I didn't know about that one. Okay, let me write that.
It has a new paragraph in it that is all about sellers' compensation, and it explains to them that they are not legally required to pay it, but that if they don't pay it, they need to be prepared that they may receive an offer where it becomes a part of the negotiation. They also need to understand that the way our forms are written out now, since these changes have gone into effect, that if a buyer were obviously has to have a written agreement about compensation that they have to pay to a buyer's broker before a house is shown to them. So this is going to become a thing. And if the seller is not basically allowing the buyer to finance in that commission by agreeing to make it a part of the purchase price.
Well, they don't care. They just want to net the most. So
the buyer pay that as additional cash to close that they have to come up with. Well, that could actually be a huge deterrent, and buyers will eliminate their house from
But we can't say that because that's steering, though, Angie, right? That's where I get all confused and scared.
Well, but the matter is, there are agents out there saying that they're going to that their buyers are requesting to not see houses.
I literally had a guy say that. Yeah.
The buyers are saying that I can't afford to pay it, and that if it's not being covered by the seller, we can't tell them
is fair.
That's not going to affect their showings. The other thing that Seth Weissman just did a video. He is the attorney for the Georgia Association of Realtors just today, and the video says that if you have a buyer that is agreed contractually to pay the commission out of pocket because it's not being paid by the seller and a part of the purchase price, and if at the 11th hour the buyer does not have enough money to cover that amount of compensation, the buyer's broker has a right to say the closing is off and this is not going forward because I'm serious, because I am not getting paid. And just like seller getting their money and the seller's broker getting their money,
true.
This is a part of the deal now.
Fair is fair.
And I have a right to say I'm not getting paid.
Oh my gosh, it's going to kill so many deals.
So I can basically say this is not closing.
And their buyer would have to sign it, right? That's my main concern, because I've had these shady agents that are like, oh, well, never mind, we're not going to make an offer anymore. I'm like, wait. So I had to give some of my commission, so he got his 1% because they weren't going to pay him anything.
Yeah, definitely watch the video because
I'm going to do that, yeah.
It's going to be harmful for everyone if the deal doesn't close because then nobody gets anything. And so in cases like that, hopefully the parties will all agree to work something out and make the numbers work.
You think.
In a fair situation. But that is a game changer where
we're going to see that
listing agents and sellers need to be aware of that potentially being a sabotage. They also need to be aware, and any buyer's agents need to be aware, that if your buyer is going to pay a portion of the agreed upon commission out of pocket, that you need to not only provide that instructions to closing attorney with the amount that the buyer's paying out of pocket in paragraph 4 of the new instructions to closing attorney, but you need to provide your buyer brokerage agreement because that's the document that established their legal obligation to pay. And you need to provide this to the buyer's lender as soon as possible because the buyer's lender is needing to verify the source of funds and where the funds for that commission payment is coming from, just like they have to verify all money that the buyer brings.
Yeah. Well, that's going to kill a lot of deals. I can already see it happening.
Well, and again,
but I guess we'll cross that
road. To scare the sellers. We're trying to.
Well, no, they need to know
that you know there are buyers that simply do not.
They're going to blame me.
Yeah. At the end of the day, they're struggling for their cash to close, and they don't have the money, and we can't do anything to interfere with that buyer-broker agreement that they have in order to see properties. And those brokers don't work for free. So we just need to make sure they understand big picture and make that informed decision.
Yeah, most of my clients, I have a new listing coming up next week, and they were like, can we please offer commission even though we can't? I'm like, yes, absolutely. It's always been negotiable. Nothing's changed. And they're like, good. So I guess that's a good example, but most of my examples are of greedy sellers that don't want to offer anything, and I'm like, okay, good luck. We're gonna cross our fingers.
And again, we can't.
I don't want to work for free.
We can't control the buyer agents.
Correct.
And even though they can say, well, of course, a buyer can negotiate that as a part of their offer, but the problem is we don't know if their buyer agent is a strong agent, and if they're educated,
the problem.
And
they have no idea.
And if they're educating their buyers that's an option.
Nope.
As what I'm hearing when I'm in meetings is I'm hearing agents say, I've told my buyer that this is the free showing form, and if they say this and it's a big fat zero and they're not willing to pay, and my buyer's like, I'm so afraid that I'll get stuck with this bill that I can't afford to pay, that I don't want you, buyer's agent, to show me property.
Yeah, I've heard that from 2 clients recently. Like, he's like, I want you to make your money, but I can't afford it. I was like, I get it.
Ultimately, it is the buyer's choice. And if the
I feel like that's such a shady line of steering. I really do. I think we're going to have a lot of fun with this, Angie. I can't wait to hear all your horror stories.
Well, it's all so new, and the confetti has all not fallen yet. That's for darn.
Oh my gosh, there's going to be glitter on all of our eyeballs. Oh
and I love this. Those of us who do this and train on this subject, we are all have a lot of questions with a big fat I don't know.
I know.
There's a lot of things yet to be.
Thanks, NAR. Love you. Love paying you all this money. Thanks for having lobbyists. Yeah. I love NAR, don't get me wrong, and that's not anything you've said. But I feel like I just wish the Q&A wasn't so Q&A politically correct-ish, and that it actually was specific. But luckily we have you and Seth Wiseman and people on the committee that are actually doing things proactively. And I don't know, what are your thoughts about the EXP buyer kit thing and or seller kit thing?
I've not really looked at that, to be honest with you, Amber. And I know
it's like a one-page thing. I mean, it's kind of like Zillow's agreement, where it's like a one-page showing agreement.
And I'm just the agreements. I have seen some agreements that did not deal with compensation. Let's just say that without naming them. and that is not compliant. And
that's what scares me. I'm not going to use those.
I will not be myself and my broker partner. We are not allowing our agents to use those to as acceptable. We are saying no, that doesn't meet the criteria because it says that basically this showing, touring, whatever you want to call it, renaming something.
Oh yeah, Zillow called it a touring agreement, and then California went up in arms about it, I believe.
Well,
and then
because in our interpretation, it absolutely, since it lacks compensation, it's that switch thing of it's not compliant. So in our opinion, it's not compliant.
No, you're right.
And if you want at minimum to have a customer agreement, the F-116 buyer customer agreement, and you want to have it good just for one day or whatever you want, that's the bare minimum. Print out a blank one and fill it in by hand and have the buyer sign that.
Keep it in your trunk.
But something that actually says that the broker, and remember, all agents are fingers attached to a body, and the body is the broker. So the agent can't do anything without the broker. And if the broker is required to have a compensation agreement with a buyer, then they got to have a compensation agreement. And if it doesn't,
we should have always had those, though. That's just so weird.
Doesn't say anything about compensation, then it's not compliant, in my opinion.
Good. I'm glad you're saying that because I was tempted to download it, and I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to ask Angie.
Well,
because you always go by the rule book, which is the best part about you, is you interpret the law in a dumbed down way for we agents and brokers or whatever, to where it makes sense, you know, because it is so confusing.
I will say I am very blessed to have some really
really
smart friends with great law degrees, and I rely on them.
I was going to ask you if you went to law school. I meant to ask you that last time.
No. I absolutely have not, but I have lots of wonderful friends with law degrees, and they are there to support me, and they better help me support you guys, because when there's a legal question, I know I have many resources I can reach out to get clarity. And
well, we have some murky waters ahead, so get excited. Your job's going to get more exciting every day.
Yep. And I'm
never a dull day.
Yes, clever ways to try and get the information out. And I will be offering the mid-year changes class.
I was about to ask you when the next class is.
I don't have that on the books, but I do have the next level, a class that will be updated, and it's probably going to take the place of the mid-year changes class, because everybody's like, oh, mid-year, that's already passed. That's yesterday's news. But I have a class called Your Money, Agency, and Brokerage Agreements. And that will take the place of the mid-year changes class, and that's the one to stay tuned for. So if you've taken mid-year changes, but obviously there's still a conversation that needs to be had around it. And one thing that I have been also emphasizing educationally for agents is please educate your buyers that you work with about the buyer duty paragraph in the buyer brokerage agreement, because you have to have that conversation that if you want your buyer agent to be eligible to receive the seller or seller broker paid compensation amount, if any is being offered, then they have to still be procuring cause of the sale. And you, as the buyer, have to stay loyal to them and follow those requirements in the buyer brokerage agreement under the buyer's duty, so that they can easily prove they're procuring cause of the sale, so they're eligible to receive that money.
I just heard that the other day, that procuring cause is basically gone out the window.
No, it's not.
It's not. So see, another misinformation.
But here's the thing that you as a listing agent need to be aware of, that if you sign the pre-showing compensation agreement, and an agent is contacting you and they're saying they're about to show your listing, but once if you have any hesitation or doubt about procuring cause of sale, do not sign and send that form, because that could obligate you. And the thought process is that you wouldn't have signed it and sent it to that particular agent if there was a bona fide question. But there will be cases where agents will parachute in, and the buyer was unrepresented, then later hires a buyer broker. So this needs to be something that agents need to just be aware, as both the buyer's agent, when they're wearing that hat, about the importance of still procuring cause of sale, and also how a parachuting agent could end up having a claim to being paid.
We love those.
Because you didn't know that they were the parachuting agent and who the buyer was they were representing, and you went ahead and sent them that document. So, yeah.
Wow.
I know.
Thank you for that. That's another good tip. Well, the good news is for agents, all of it's really all one and the same. You still have to do your job. You still have to sell yourself. You still have to sell your value. You still have to sell what it is that you do differently. And now it's just more transparent. And maybe you have to fill out one extra form. But, the agents that have always been doing a good job with buyers are still going to keep doing a good job with buyers, and they're still going to get compensated, and sellers are still going to offer it. I have sellers that refuse not to offer it. They want my commission cut and the buyer agent to get more.
And it's also very, very important that they understand that a buyer now, if you're going to be compensated by someone other than the buyer who hired you, they must consent to that. So that buyer consent paragraph is so, so important. And if you have a buyer brokerage agreement that is still alive, whether you're under a purchase and sale agreement or not, you need to get that thing amended.
Immediately.
The July 1st versions that came out on July 1st, and it does not have the buyer consent paragraph consenting to you receiving XYZ amount of compensation from a seller or seller's broker. Use the amendment to brokerage agreement and mark the box that says which type of brokerage agreement you're amending. For example, the exclusive buyer brokerage engagement agreement, and then state in there, buyer hereby consents to buyer's broker receiving compensation in the amount of blank % of the purchase price from seller or seller's broker, and put that in there and get that amended. That is the one document that really has to be amended as we go into these changes in effect. If you have an older version of the buyer brokerage agreement.
Yeah, all of mine are old. I got to update everything. Well, thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
It sounds like our key takeaways are Form F258 or 259, right?
Well, 258 is absolutely going to be used, needs to be used every time. I've also heard some rumors that the people are saying that if you've got an exhibit to the contract showing the compensation, that you don't need the instructions to closing attorney. I don't believe that.
Yeah, you do.
I think that we need to best practice, because the exhibit to the purchase and sale is not advised to be used in every situation. You don't need to put the compensation in the purchase and sale if you have a fully executed F258 pre-showing compensation agreement. There's no need to put the exhibit regarding the broker's compensation as a part of the purchase and sale. But I think that we still need the instructions to closing attorney, and it also has some important disclosure blanks in it. So that still needs to be used just like it always was. And but the F258, the pre-showing compensation, that's something that listing agents need to get prepared. They need to have it readily available, and they need to be prepared to send it to buyer agents when they are preparing to show property. And buyer agents need to seek to obtain that before they show, but in my opinion, they still need to show. They need to always give those pre-showing compensations to their buyers, because this affects the buyers' out-of-pocket expense potentially. And then when you go to write an offer, if you don't have, at that time, that signed pre-showing compensation document showing that what the seller is willing to pay in the way of buyer broker compensation, or if you have one and the amount is not an agreeable amount to the buyer, that's when then you go to Plan B, which is then include the F259 broker compensation exhibit, or the special stip 620, and ask seller to pay buyer broker compensation on buyer's behalf.
Yes, it's all the same stuff. It's just more transparent, and we have to do forms.
Yes, but it will become second nature in no time.
Yeah, we'll get used to it. I don't know why everyone's up in arms. I think it's probably a lot of our old senior people that don't like their cheese to be moved.
Well, yes, I'm not a big fan of change, but over the years, I have learned to kind of roll with it and embrace it because it's going to happen whether you like it or not. And I will tell you that sometimes it can actually be such an amazing, fabulous thing that we fear it, but then in retrospect, we're like, wow, that was actually a good change.
Yeah. So, it's not like they're eliminating, commission. So agents that are like going back to their teaching jobs, like your commission's not eliminated. You just have to prove your worth and actually have a conversation with someone and actually fill out one page form.
And be really transparent about the fact that they have to knowingly agree to how you earn your money and who pays what. And it's got to be very, very transparent to the public.
I'm just curious how they're going to police all of this. That should be interesting as well. Well, maybe you should warn your buyer agent team people at Keller Williams, because there's a lot of teams that they don't know who they're talking to. It could be a fake buyer, because I know they've done that before. So that'll keep us all honest and transparent.
I have.
I've had calls that I'm like, who is this?
It's
they like try to make me answer like racial questions. I'm like, what in the world?
Oh yeah. What? Yeah, absolutely not. But yeah, thank you for having me. And
thank you so much. We went way overboard, but thank you so much.
My pleasure as always. And I will forward you that video from Seth Weissman, so you can share that on your social media as well. Just
we all need to watch it.
Yes, because it's very interesting, and it's something that, again, it's all about education. When someone's making a decision, we want them to make the most informed decision about what's in it for them. We're not trying to steer them one direction or another, but they need to, before they make a decision, they need to understand all things that could affect that decision and then decide, is this really what's best for me? And and the more you are educated as the agent or realtor that is representing a buyer seller, and the more you can explain to them what's in it for them and why, this is all the, parts that are affecting, should be affecting your decision to do this or to do that, or should not do this or should not do that, then they get to decide. But they need to have a complete understanding, a global understanding of what goes into that decision. So the more we are educated, the more we can then educate them.
And we forget because we're staring at it all day long, and like we're going to quit. Like today even, I was like, oh my gosh, this poor power of attorney for my client who's in Bulgaria. He probably has no idea what's going on. He barely speaks English. And I'm sitting there like, here, sign this. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we forget that like people don't close on houses every day. It's like maybe every 10 years if they're lucky. And so knowledge is power and ignorance is fear, is what my coach says. So knowledge is everything. That's why we love you. And you got to make sure that you tell me the dates for your next classes, and I'll post those too.
I will. I'm about to add a lot to the calendar. Right now the calendar is pretty bare, but that doesn't mean that they're not out there. They're being booked right now. I've just got to get them on that website. So
try to do more virtual ones too if you can.
I will. I will still do my occasional Saturday Zoom classes because I get a big turnout, usually 80 to 90 people on those.
Oh, I'm not shocked at all. I'm surprised it's not even higher because like I was about to sign up for your last one and I was traveling, so I couldn't. But I definitely want to do another one. Every time I do one, even if it's the same title, every time I do one of your classes, you always have it updated. It's not like it's not like you're reading off a script. It's always new information. So we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
So stay tuned. I'll send you that video.
Thank you.
Please share it because I think we all need to share as much information as we can right now.
Yep, and it's going to be fine, guys. Don't freak out.
Yeah.
It's all good.
Yeah, just some adjustments in our procedures.
Yes, and rates went down, so we're good.
Yay!
Thanks, Angie. I appreciate you so much.
Thanks, Amber.
Okay, talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.